The Lord's voice pierced through the darkness of the temple, calling a child who would reshape nations. Before kings ruled Israel, before David's psalms echoed through history, there was Samuel, born from tears, chosen before birth, destined to pour holy oil upon the heads of those who would rule God's people. This is the prophecy fulfilled in flesh. A man who spoke directly with the Almighty, whose words could lift peasants to thrones and cast down mighty rulers. He walked between the seen and unseen realms, interpreting divine visions that would echo through generations. Samuel's story is written in the language of the prophets, where barren wombs conceive through faith, where children hear the Creator's whispers, and where mortal hands become instruments of eternal purposes. Witness the rise of one who stood as heaven's messenger on earth, whose legacy flows through every crown and kingdom that followed. In the rolling hills of ancient Israel, where olive trees dotted the landscape and shepherds watched their flocks, there lived a woman whose heart carried a pain that seemed too heavy to bear. Hannah was married to a good man named Elkanah from the town of Ramathaim, who loved her with all his heart. But she faced a reality that cut through her soul every single day. She had no children. In a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by the sons she bore and daughters she raised, Hannah felt invisible and forgotten by both society and, it seemed, by God himself. But her pain ran much deeper than social shame or cultural expectations. She genuinely longed to hold a baby in her arms, to sing soft lullabies in the quiet of night, to watch tiny fingers wrap around hers, and to see her own eyes reflected in a child's face. Year after year, she watched her husband's other wife, Peninnah, parade her children around the house, never missing a chance to remind Hannah of what she lacked, especially during the religious festivals when fertility was seen as God's special blessing. The annual family trip to Shiloh should have been a time of joy, celebration, and worship, but for Hannah, it became a painful reminder of her empty womb and silent nursery. Each time she saw other mothers bringing their children to the temple, her heart broke a little more. As 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10 tells us, in bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. She walked into that sacred place where God's presence was said to dwell among his people, and with tears streaming down her face like a river, she poured out her heart like water before the altar. Her prayer was not polite, formal, or carefully worded like the prayers she had heard priests offer. It was raw, desperate, completely honest, and came from the deepest part of her being. She told God exactly how she felt, holding nothing back, and made a promise that would echo through history. If he would give her a son, she would give that precious child back to serve in his house all the days of his life. Hannah did not try to bargain with God or make conditions. She surrendered herself and her future completely to his will. Old Eli had served faithfully as priest at Shiloh for many years, watching over the sacred tent where the Ark of the Covenant rested, and he thought he had seen every kind of worshipper and every type of prayer. He sat in his customary spot by the doorpost of the temple, a place where he could observe the steady stream of pilgrims who came and went throughout each day. His eyes had grown dim with age, but his heart still beat with love for God's house and God's people. But that particular day, something unusual caught his attention and made him look more carefully. A woman stood near the altar, and her behavior was unlike anything he had witnessed in all his years of service. Her whole body shook with intense emotion. Her lips moved rapidly and continuously, but no sound whatsoever came from her mouth. She swayed back and forth as if in great distress, completely lost in the intensity of her prayer, with tears falling freely to the ground beneath her feet. Eli watched her for several long minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and wondering if he should intervene. In his many years of experience, the only time he had seen people act with such abandon and lack of self-control was when they had consumed too much wine during the festivals. He made a quick judgment based on appearances and decided he needed to intervene to protect the sanctity of God's house. Walking over to Hannah with all the authority of his priestly position, Eli confronted her directly and sternly. As 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 13 carefully records, Hannah spoke in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. He told her firmly to put away her wine and show proper respect and dignity in God's house, as this was no place for such behavior. But Hannah looked up at this priest with a dignity and composure that completely surprised him. She had not been drinking anything stronger than water. She had been praying with every fiber of her being, every ounce of her strength, and every fragment of her broken heart. She explained with quiet grace that she was a woman of sorrowful spirit, pouring out her very soul to the Lord in the only way she knew how. When Eli realized his terrible mistake and understood the depth of her pain, he felt the full weight of his wrong assumption pressing down on him. This was not a drunk woman making a disgraceful scene in God's house. This was a broken heart seeking the only help that could truly heal her. His tone completely changed from stern rebuke to gentle blessing. In verse 17, he spoke words that would prove prophetic. "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." These words from God's appointed priest felt like a promise delivered straight from heaven's throne. Something remarkable and beautiful happened to Hannah's heart after she left the temple that day. The heavy burden she had carried for so many years, the weight that had pressed down on her shoulders and made each day feel like climbing a mountain, suddenly felt different. The pain was still there, but something had shifted in her spirit. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 18 tells us that the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. She had left her deepest pain and most desperate longings at God's feet, and an unexplainable peace had taken its place in her heart. Hannah returned home with Elkanah, and soon the miracle she had prayed for with such intensity began to unfold in the most natural and beautiful way. The God who had created life in the very beginning, who had formed Adam from dust and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, remembered this faithful woman who had cried out to him in her desperation. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 20 records the beautiful and long-awaited moment. It came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked for him from the Lord." When Hannah held her baby boy for the first time, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her chest and looking into his perfect little face, she knew exactly what his name would be without any hesitation. Samuel means heard by God or asked of God. And every single time someone spoke his name throughout his entire life, they would remember that this child existed because the Lord heard a mother's desperate prayer and chose to answer it with overwhelming grace. This was not just any ordinary baby born to any ordinary family. This was a child born from direct divine intervention, destined for purposes that Hannah could only begin to imagine, and God would reveal in his perfect timing. She had asked God for a son in her barrenness, and God had given her one who would literally reshape the entire nation of Israel and change the course of history. When the time came for Hannah to fulfill the solemn vow she had made in her desperation, her heart did not break with unbearable sorrow. Instead, it overflowed with praise and thanksgiving that seemed to bubble up from the very depths of her soul. She brought little Samuel to the temple at Shiloh, and standing in that exact same place where she had wept so bitterly and prayed so desperately just a few years before, she lifted her voice in a song that rang through the temple courts and seemed to reach the very heavens themselves. This was not a quiet prayer whispered under her breath or a simple thank you offered in private. Hannah sang with the power and joy of someone who had personally witnessed God work absolute miracles in her life. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verses 1 and 2 capture just the beginning of her magnificent praise. "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." No one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. But Hannah's song went far beyond her personal joy and thanksgiving for answered prayer. The Spirit of God seemed to fill her words and inspire her voice as she sang prophetically about how the Lord works throughout the world and throughout history. She declared with confidence that the bows of mighty warriors would be broken, while those who stumbled would find supernatural strength. She sang about how those who were full and satisfied would hire themselves out for bread, while the hungry would feast at tables overflowing with good things. Her voice proclaimed with authority that the Lord makes poor and makes rich, brings low the proud, and lifts up the humble from the dust. This mother, who had once been barren and forgotten, now sang that even the barren woman would bear 7 children, while she who had many would become feeble. Hannah's song was prophecy beautifully wrapped in praise, revealing eternal truths about God's character and his ways that would echo through all the ages to come. The day that Hannah had both eagerly anticipated and secretly dreaded finally arrived with all its mixed emotions. Samuel was now old enough to live away from his mother's daily care, and it was time for her to fulfill the sacred vow she had made to the Lord in her desperation. Picture this precious young boy, probably only 3 or 4 years old, walking hand in hand with his beloved mother toward the massive temple complex at Shiloh, his little legs working hard to keep up with her longer strides. For Samuel, this was probably just another exciting adventure to the special place where God lived. He had no idea that he would not be returning home with his parents that day, or that his entire life was about to change forever. Hannah found Eli the priest and approached him with her little son, standing quietly beside her, probably clinging to her robe and looking around with wide eyes at all the activity in the temple. The old priest probably did not recognize her at first, as several years had passed since their memorable encounter. But Hannah gently reminded him of their previous meeting with words that must have stirred his memory. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 26, she said respectfully, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord." She then explained with a mixture of joy and heartbreak that this beautiful, healthy child standing beside her was the direct answer to that desperate prayer he had witnessed years before. God had given her exactly what she had asked for with such tears and anguish, and now she was faithfully keeping her part of the sacred bargain she had made. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 28 records her carefully chosen words, "Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." Hannah knelt down to Samuel's level, looked into his trusting eyes, kissed her precious son goodbye with all the love a mother's heart could hold, knowing that she was placing him directly into God's hands for a future she could not see but completely trusted. This was not abandonment or rejection. This was the ultimate act of faith, obedience, and surrender to God's will. She had asked God for this specific child with the express purpose of giving him back for sacred service. And now she was courageously trusting that God's plan for Samuel was infinitely greater than her natural desire to keep him safe and close to her. Samuel's childhood was completely unlike any other boy's experience in all of Israel. While other children his age played in dusty village streets, helped their fathers tend sheep or work in fields, and learned ordinary trades from their families, Samuel grew up in the most sacred and holy place in the entire nation. The temple at Shiloh was where the precious Ark of the Covenant rested, in the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was said to dwell among his people in a very special and powerful way. This remarkable place became Samuel's home, his playground, his classroom, and his workplace all at the same time. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 18 tells us that Samuel ministered before the Lord, even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. The ephod was a special sacred garment worn by those who served in temple worship. Imagine a small boy dressed in miniature priestly clothes, solemnly learning to help with the sacred duties that connected heaven and earth in ways he was only beginning to understand. Eli took Samuel completely under his protective wing, patiently teaching him all the intricate rituals and serious responsibilities of temple service that had been passed down through generations. Samuel learned how to carefully tend the golden lampstand that burned continually before the Lord, how to properly prepare the sacred bread of the presence that was placed before God, and how to respectfully assist when pilgrims brought their various offerings and sacrifices to the Lord. Each year, when Hannah and Elkanah made their annual pilgrimage for the required sacrifice, Hannah brought Samuel a brand new coat that she had carefully and lovingly made with her own hands during the long months of separation. She would measure how much he had grown in height and strength and pour all her mother's love, hopes, and prayers into every single stitch of that precious garment. The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 26, that the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor both with the Lord and men. He was becoming not just physically taller and stronger with each passing year, but also wiser, more mature, and more beloved by everyone who had the privilege of knowing him and watching him serve. While little Samuel learned day by day to serve the living God with pure motives, genuine love and childlike reverence, a dark and troubling shadow hung over the very temple where he lived and served. Eli's own adult sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had been appointed to serve as priests, following in their father's footsteps. But somewhere along the way, they had completely forgotten what it truly meant to honor and serve the holy God they claimed to represent. The Bible does not sugarcoat their character or try to excuse their behavior in any way. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 12 states with stark honesty that the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. These were grown men who had been raised in the temple just like Samuel was being raised, who had been taught the same sacred rituals and given the same spiritual instruction. But somewhere along their journey, their hearts had turned completely cold toward God and His ways. They treated their sacred priestly duties like nothing more than a profitable business opportunity rather than the holy calling it was meant to be. When faithful people brought their sacrifices to offer to the Lord according to His commands, Hophni and Phinehas would arrogantly send their servants to take the very best portions for themselves before God received what rightfully belonged to Him. They completely ignored the proper procedures that God Himself had established through Moses and just grabbed whatever they wanted for their own pleasure and profit. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 17 tells us that the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord. For men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Their shameless greed and complete irreverence made God's people actually hate coming to worship the Lord they loved. Families who should have found joy, peace, and blessing in bringing their offerings to God instead dreaded encountering these corrupt and selfish priests who had turned worship into extortion. The contrast between young Samuel and Eli's sons was absolutely stark and deeply painful to observe. Here was an innocent young boy who served with pure joy, humble reverence, and genuine love for God, while these grown men who should have been examples brought nothing but shame, disgust, and dishonor to God's holy house. Eli knew very well about his sons' terrible behavior and the damage they were causing, but he had become too old and weak to effectively stop them or hold them accountable for their sins. One perfectly ordinary night became the most extraordinary and life-changing moment of Samuel's entire young life. He had settled down to sleep in his usual place within the temple, positioned near the sacred ark of God, where the golden lampstand cast gentle, flickering shadows on the ancient walls and filled the holy space with soft, warm light. The temple was completely quiet, except for the peaceful sounds of the night, perhaps the distant call of an owl or the whisper of wind through the courtyard. Samuel was probably dreaming innocent childhood dreams when suddenly, without any warning, a voice cut clearly and distinctly through the silence, calling his name with unmistakable clarity and authority. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 4 records this pivotal moment. The Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." Samuel immediately assumed that Eli was calling for him. Perhaps the elderly priest needed help getting up from his bed, or required assistance with something urgent, or wanted Samuel to bring him water or food. Without hesitation, he jumped up from his sleeping place and ran quickly through the dimly lit temple to Eli's bedside, ready and eager to serve however he was needed. But Eli looked completely confused and told Samuel gently that he had not called him at all. The old priest instructed him to go back to his place and lie down again. Samuel returned to his sleeping area, puzzled by what had happened, but obedient to Eli's instruction. Then, just as he was settling back down, it happened again. The voice called, "Samuel?" with the same clear authority, and once more the boy hurried to Eli, absolutely certain that the priest needed his help. Again, Eli told him kindly that he had not called and sent him back to bed. When the mysterious voice called Samuel's name a third time, and the boy ran to Eli again with the same eager willingness to serve, the old priest finally understood what was actually happening. Verse Samuel Chapter 3, verse 8 tells us that Eli perceived that the Lord had called the boy. This was not a dream or imagination or the confused hearing of a sleepy child. The God of Israel, the creator of heaven and earth, was speaking directly to this young boy for reasons that would soon become clear. Eli instructed Samuel carefully that if the voice came again, he should respond with the words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." Samuel returned to his place with his young heart pounding with excitement, wonder and perhaps a little fear, waiting and listening in the darkness for what might happen next. When God called his name the fourth time, young Samuel was ready with the exact words Eli had taught him, opening his heart completely to receive whatever message the Lord of all creation wanted to give him. When Samuel heard God's voice calling his name that fourth time, he spoke the words Eli had taught him, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." What came next was not the gentle, encouraging message you might expect for a young boy's first conversation with God. Instead, the Lord gave Samuel one of the most difficult prophecies anyone could ever be asked to deliver. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 11 and 12 record God's sobering words. "Behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end." God told Samuel that Eli's family would be judged because the old priest knew about his son's terrible sins but failed to stop them. The punishment would be severe and permanent. No sacrifice or offering would ever be able to remove this judgment. Samuel lay awake for the rest of that night, his young mind wrestling with the weight of what he had heard. How could he tell this kind man who had raised him and cared for him such devastating news? When morning came, Samuel went about his usual duties, opening the doors of the temple as he did every day, but his heart was heavy with the burden of God's message. Eli noticed something was different and called Samuel to him. The old priest knew that God had spoken to the boy, and he demanded to hear every word. In 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 17, Eli said, "What is the word that the Lord spoke to you? Please do not hide it from me. God do so to you, and more also if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you." With trembling voice, young Samuel told Eli everything exactly as God had spoken it, holding back nothing, despite how painful it was to deliver such news to someone he loved. After Samuel delivered that first prophecy to Eli, something remarkable began to happen throughout the land of Israel. Word spread from village to village and town to town that a young boy at the temple in Shiloh was hearing directly from God. This was not just gossip or wishful thinking. People could see that Samuel was different, that his words carried divine authority and always came to pass exactly as he spoke them. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 19 tells us that Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. Every single prophecy that came from Samuel's lips proved to be completely accurate and true. When he said something would happen, it happened exactly as he had predicted. News of this young prophet traveled faster than merchants on the trade routes. Farmers working in their fields heard about the boy who spoke with God. Shepherds watching their flocks shared stories about Samuel's prophecies around their campfires. City dwellers in marketplaces discussed the amazing things happening at Shiloh. From the northern mountains to the southern desert, from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River, everyone was talking about Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 20 records the widespread recognition. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. This phrase, from Dan to Beersheba, meant from the very top of Israel to the very bottom. The entire nation recognized that God had chosen this young man as his spokesman. Samuel was no longer just the boy who had grown up in the temple. He was now God's official messenger to his people. When Samuel spoke, it was as if God himself was speaking through him, and everyone knew it. The day that would become one of the darkest in Israel's history began like any other, but it would end with unthinkable tragedy. The Philistines, Israel's longtime enemies who lived along the coast, had gathered their armies for war once again. The Israelites assembled their own forces to meet them in battle, confident that they could defeat these uncircumcised foreigners who dared to challenge God's chosen people. But something went terribly wrong on the battlefield. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 2 tells us the shocking result. The Philistines put themselves in battle array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men of the army in the field. The Israelite soldiers retreated in confusion and fear, unable to understand how they could have lost so badly. In their desperation, the elders made a decision that seemed logical, but revealed their misunderstanding of how God works. They decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, thinking it would guarantee them victory. When the Ark arrived, carried by Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, the Israelite camp erupted in such loud shouting that the earth seemed to shake. Even the Philistines heard the noise and were afraid when they learned that Israel's God had come to the camp. But their fear turned to determination, and they fought even harder than before. The second battle was even more devastating than the first. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 10 records the catastrophic defeat. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. There was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers, but the worst was yet to come. In the chaos of the battle, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed, and the unthinkable happened. The Philistines captured the Ark of God itself, while the battle raged in the distance. Old Eli sat by the road leading into Shiloh, his heart trembling with worry about the Ark of God. His eyes were too dim to see clearly anymore, but his ears were still sharp enough to catch the sound of running feet and voices crying out in distress. A man from the tribe of Benjamin came running from the battlefield with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, the universal signs of terrible news. The whole city began crying out when they saw him, and Eli heard the commotion from his seat by the roadside. When Eli asked what all the noise was about, the messenger approached him with the devastating report. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 17 records the soldier's words, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has been a great slaughter among the people. Also your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured." Eli could handle hearing about Israel's defeat. He could even bear the news that his two sons had been killed in battle. But when the messenger said that the Ark of God had been captured, something broke inside the old priest. 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 18 tells us what happened next. Then it happened, when he made mention of the Ark of God, that Eli fell off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. For 4 decades, Eli had served as both priest and judge over Israel. He had raised Samuel like his own son and faithfully served in God's house. But in the end, he died from the shock of hearing that the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in all of Israel, the symbol of God's presence among his people, had fallen into enemy hands. The prophecy that young Samuel had delivered was beginning. to come true in the most painful way possible. The Philistines were thrilled with their victory and especially proud that they had captured Israel's famous ark. They carried it to their city of Ashdod like a trophy of war and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon, setting it right beside their idol as if to show that Dagon was stronger than the God of Israel. But they quickly learned that the God of Israel was not powerless outside his own land. The next morning, when the priests of Dagon came to their temple, they found their god fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They set Dagon back up, thinking it was just an accident. But the following morning brought an even more shocking sight. 1 Samuel chapter 5 verse 4 describes what they found. And when they arose early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. The head of Dagon and both the palms of its hands were broken off on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso was left of it. Their mighty God had been completely destroyed by the presence of Israel's God. But the humiliation of Dagon was just the beginning of their troubles. 1 Samuel chapter 5 verse 6 tells us that the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he ravaged them and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. A plague of painful tumors broke out among the people, and they realized that keeping the ark was bringing disaster upon their city. They quickly decided to move it to another Philistine city called Gath, but the same thing happened there. The people of Gath also broke out in tumors, and panic spread throughout the city. Desperate to get rid of this dangerous object, they sent the ark to Ekron, but the people there wanted nothing to do with it. 1 Samuel chapter 5 verse 10 records their terrified response. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron, and it happened, as the ark of God came to Ekron, that the Ekronites cried out, saying, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people." The ark had brought nothing but disaster wherever it went in Philistine territory. After 7 months of plagues, tumors, and disasters, the Philistines had enough. They desperately wanted to get rid of the ark, but they were afraid to simply send it back empty-handed in case that made things even worse. Their priests and diviners came up with a plan to test whether their troubles were really caused by the God of Israel or just bad luck. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verses 4 and 5 records their solution. Then they said, "What is the trespass offering which we shall return to him?" But they answered, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For the same plague was on all of you and on your lords. They made golden models of the tumors that had afflicted them, and golden mice to represent the rodents that had overrun their land. But the most interesting part of their plan was how they decided to transport the ark. They took 2 milk cows that had never been yoked before, hitched them to a new cart, and put the ark on it along with the gold offerings. Then they shut the calves away and let the cows go wherever they wanted. Their reasoning was simple. If the cows went toward Israel, despite their natural instinct to return to their calves, then they would know for certain that Israel's God had caused all their troubles. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verse 12 tells us what happened. Then the cows headed straight for the road to Beth Shemesh, and went along the highway, lowing as they went, and did not turn aside to the right hand or the left. And the lords of the Philistines went after them to the border of Beth Shemesh. The cows walked in a straight line toward Israel, mooing for their calves, but never turning back. The Philistine leaders followed at a distance until they reached the border, then watched as the people of Beth Shemesh joyfully received their ark back. The test had worked perfectly. There was no doubt that the God of Israel had orchestrated everything that had happened. 20 years passed after the ark returned to Israel, and during this time Samuel grew into his role as the nation's spiritual leader. The people were living under Philistine oppression, feeling defeated and discouraged, when Samuel stood before them with a message that would change everything. He did not offer them military strategy or political solutions. Instead, he went straight to the heart of their real problem, their relationship with God. Samuel told them plainly that their troubles came from abandoning the Lord and worshipping foreign gods. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 3 records his direct challenge. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, "If you return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines." Samuel was not interested in half-hearted promises or surface changes. He demanded complete repentance. They had to throw away every foreign idol, every statue of Ashtoreth and Baal that they had been secretly worshipping alongside the Lord. This was not about adding the Lord to their collection of gods. This was about serving him alone with undivided hearts. The people listened to Samuel's words and realized he was right. They had been trying to serve God while also keeping one foot in the pagan religions of their neighbors, and it was not working. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 4 tells us their response. So the children of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreths and served the Lord only. They went through their homes and destroyed every foreign idol they could find. They cleaned out their secret shrines and threw away their good luck charms. For the first time in years, Israel was ready to serve the Lord with hearts that were completely devoted to him. Samuel had prepared them for what would come. Next, Samuel called all of Israel to gather at Mizpah for a special time of prayer and sacrifice to the Lord. This was not going to be a military rally or a strategy meeting. This was going to be a spiritual revival where the people would seek God's face together. When the Israelites assembled at Mizpah, they did something that showed their complete dependence on God. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 6 tells us that they gathered together at Mizpah, drew water and poured it out before the Lord, and fasted that day, and said there, "We have sinned against the Lord." Pouring out water was a symbol of pouring out their hearts before God, admitting their complete helplessness without him. But their gathering did not go unnoticed by their enemies. When the Philistines heard that all of Israel had assembled in one place, they saw it as the perfect opportunity to attack and destroy them once and for all. The Philistine army began marching toward Mizpah, and when the Israelites heard they were coming, fear gripped their hearts. They begged Samuel not to stop praying for them, saying in 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 8, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines." Samuel took a young lamb and offered it as a burnt offering to the Lord, crying out to God on behalf of his people. At the exact moment Samuel was making his sacrifice and prayer, the Lord answered in a way that no one expected. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 10 records the amazing intervention. Now as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a loud thunder upon the Philistines that day, and so confused them that they were overcome before Israel. God himself fought for his people, sending such terrifying thunder that the Philistine army fell into complete panic and confusion. The Israelites pursued them and won a total victory without Samuel even having to organize a military strategy. After the battle, Samuel took a large stone and set it up as a memorial between Mizpah and Shen. 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 12 tells us that he called its name Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." The name Ebenezer means stone of help, and it would remind future generations that their victory came not from their own strength, but from the Lord who heard their prayers and fought their battles for them. As Samuel grew older and his hair turned gray, he decided it was time to begin training his sons to help him judge Israel. Following the pattern that many fathers used in those days, he appointed his two sons, Joel and Abijah, as judges over the southern regions of the land. Samuel himself had been raised with integrity and had served God faithfully all his life, so he naturally hoped his sons would follow the same path. But something had gone terribly wrong in their hearts. Unlike their father who judged with fairness and feared God, Joel and Abijah saw their positions as opportunities to get rich. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 3 tells us the sad truth about their character. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. These young men took money from people who wanted favorable judgments, and they twisted the law to benefit whoever paid them the most. Instead of protecting the poor and defending the innocent like their father had taught them, they sold justice to the highest bidder. When a wealthy person had a dispute with a poor person, Joel and Abijah would listen to see who offered them more money, then make their decision based on profit rather than truth. Word of their corruption spread quickly throughout the land. People who had respected Samuel and trusted his judgment were shocked and disappointed to discover that his own sons had turned their backs on everything he stood for. Farmers who had disputes about land boundaries found that justice depended on how much they could afford to pay. Merchants who had been cheated in business deals learned that the courts were just as corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to punish. The very system that Samuel had worked so hard to establish with fairness and godliness was being destroyed by his own children. Samuel's heart must have broken when he heard the reports of what Joel and Abijah were doing. But the damage to his reputation and to the people's faith in leadership had already been done. The corruption of Samuel's sons became the final straw that pushed the elders of Israel to make a decision that would change their nation forever. These were the leading men from all the tribes, the ones who had watched Samuel lead with wisdom and integrity for years, and they knew they could not allow Joel and Abijah to continue in positions of authority. But instead of asking Samuel to remove his sons or appoint different judges, they came to him with a completely different proposal. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 4 tells us that all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. When they found the old prophet, they spoke with the respect due to his position, but with the firmness of men who had made up their minds. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 5, they presented their request. Look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Their logic seemed reasonable on the surface. Samuel was getting old, his sons were corrupt, and they needed a different kind of leadership for the future. But their request revealed something deeper about their hearts. They were tired of being different from the nations around them. Every other country had a king who lived in a palace, led armies into battle, and made them feel important and powerful. Israel had only judges appointed by God, and apparently that was not impressive enough anymore. They wanted to be like Egypt, with its Pharaoh, like Babylon, with its mighty ruler, like all the nations that seemed stronger and more organized than they were. They had forgotten that their strength was supposed to come from God, not from human rulers. The elders had convinced themselves that a king would solve all their problems. He would provide better leadership, stronger military protection, and give them the respect of other nations. Samuel listened to their words with a heavy heart, knowing that this request was about much more than just replacing corrupt judges. Samuel was deeply troubled by the elders' request for a king, and he did what he always did when facing difficult decisions. He took the matter to the Lord in prayer. But before God gave him an answer, Samuel felt compelled to explain to the people exactly what they were asking for. He had seen how kings ruled in other nations, and he knew that royal power came with a heavy price that the people had never considered. Standing before the elders and speaking with the authority of a prophet who had served God for decades, Samuel painted a picture of what life under a king would really look like. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 11 begins his sobering description, and he said, "This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots." Samuel explained that their sons would be drafted into the king's army, forced to serve as soldiers, chariot drivers, and royal guards whether they wanted to or not. But the king's demands would not stop with their sons. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 13 continues the warning. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks and bakers. Their daughters would become servants in the royal palace, working long hours to maintain the king's lifestyle and comfort. Samuel went on to describe how the king would take the best of their fields, vineyards, and olive groves for himself and give them to his officials. He would demand a tenth of their grain and their flocks, making himself wealthy while the people worked harder for less. The prophet's voice grew more intense as he delivered the final part of his warning in 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 17. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you will be his servants. Samuel wanted them to understand that they were not just asking for a leader. They were asking to become subjects of a human ruler who would treat them like his property. They would give up their freedom and their direct relationship with God as their only king in exchange for a man who would tax them, control them, and use them for his own purposes. When Samuel finished explaining the cost of kingship to the people, he went to the Lord with his concerns, probably hoping that God would tell him to refuse their request completely. But God's response surprised Samuel and revealed something about the situation that the prophet had not fully understood. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 7 records the Lord's words to Samuel. Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. God explained to Samuel that this was not really about Samuel's leadership or even his son's corruption. This was about Israel's relationship with their heavenly king. For centuries, God had been their only ruler, guiding them through judges and prophets, protecting them from enemies, and providing everything they needed. But now, they wanted a human king like the nations around them, which meant they were essentially firing God from his position as their sovereign. The Lord went on to give Samuel more insight into the hearts of his people. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 8, God said, "According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." This request for a king was just the latest example of Israel's long pattern of rejecting God's authority and wanting to be like everyone else. They had worshipped foreign idols, adopted pagan customs, and now they wanted pagan-style leadership too. But surprisingly, God told Samuel to give them what they wanted. 1 Samuel chapter 8 verse 9 records God's instruction, "Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." God would allow them to have a king, but they needed to understand exactly what they were choosing and what they were giving up. Samuel was to grant their request while making sure they could never claim they had not been warned about the consequences. In the territory of Benjamin, there lived a wealthy man named Kish, who had a son that everyone noticed when he walked by. This young man's name was Saul, and he was not only tall and handsome, but carried himself with the kind of presence that made people turn their heads and take a second look. 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 2 describes him this way, "And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people." Saul seemed to have everything going for him. Good looks, impressive height, a wealthy family, and natural leadership qualities that people could see just by watching him. But one ordinary day, something happened that would change his life forever, though he had no idea what God was arranging behind the scenes. Kish's donkeys had wandered off and disappeared, which was a serious problem since these animals were valuable property that the family depended on for transportation and carrying loads. Kish sent Saul and one of their servants to search for the missing donkeys, expecting them to find the animals quickly and bring them home. Saul and the servant searched diligently through the hill country of Ephraim, through the land of Shalisha, and through the land of Shalim, but they could not find the donkeys anywhere. After days of looking in every possible place, they were getting tired and discouraged. The servant finally suggested that since they were in the area, they should ask the famous prophet Samuel for help. 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 6 records the servant's reasoning. "Look now, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. So let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go." Saul agreed to the suggestion, thinking that this prophet might be able to tell them where to find their father's donkeys. He had no idea that God had orchestrated this entire situation to bring him face to face with Samuel at exactly the right moment. The day before Saul arrived in Samuel's city, something extraordinary happened that showed how perfectly God orchestrates events according to his plan. Samuel was going about his normal activities when the Lord spoke to him with specific information about a visitor who would arrive the next day. This was not a vague prophecy or a symbolic vision. God gave Samuel precise details about who was coming and why. 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 15 tells us that the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came, saying, God had whispered directly into Samuel's ear, giving him advance notice about this important meeting. In 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 16, the Lord revealed his plan. Tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. God was not only telling Samuel that Israel's first king was coming tomorrow, but he was also explaining why this change in leadership was necessary. The Philistines were still a constant threat to Israel's security and freedom, and God had chosen this particular man from the tribe of Benjamin to lead his people in battle against their enemies. Samuel must have spent that evening in prayer and preparation, knowing that he was about to meet and anoint the man who would become Israel's first king. He probably wondered what this Benjamite would look like, what kind of character he would have, and how the people would respond to God's choice. When Saul actually arrived in the city the next day, asking about the location of the prophet's house, Samuel knew immediately that this was the man God had told him about. The physical description matched perfectly. The timing was exactly as God had said, and Samuel could sense that this was a divine appointment rather than a coincidence. God had prepared both men for this moment that would mark the beginning of a new era in Israel's history. When Saul found Samuel and asked about the prophet's house, Samuel revealed his identity and immediately began treating this young man like royalty, though Saul had no idea why. Samuel invited Saul and his servant to join him for a feast where 30 special guests were waiting, and he gave Saul the place of honor along with the best portion of meat that had been specially reserved for him. Throughout the meal, Samuel spoke to Saul about important matters, and that evening he brought Saul up to his house for private conversation. When morning came, Samuel asked Saul to send his servant ahead while they walked together privately. It was then that Samuel revealed why God had brought Saul to him. 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 1 records this historic moment. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head, and kissed him and said, "Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance?" The oil that Samuel poured on Saul's head was not ordinary oil. This was the sacred anointing oil used to set apart priests and now, for the first time, a king. As the oil ran down Saul's face and soaked into his hair, Samuel explained that God had chosen him to be the ruler over Israel. But Samuel did not stop with the anointing ceremony. He gave Saul detailed prophecies about signs he would encounter on his journey home, signs that would confirm that God had truly called him to be king. Samuel told him that he would meet 2 men by Rachel's tomb who would tell him the donkeys had been found and that his father was now worried about him instead of the animals. Then he would meet 3 men going to worship God at Bethel, carrying bread and wine, and they would give him some of their bread. Finally, Samuel said that when Saul reached Gibeah, he would encounter a group of prophets coming down from the high place, and the Spirit of God would come upon him so powerfully that he would prophesy with them and be changed into a different person. 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 6 records Samuel's promise, "Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another." man. These signs would prove to Saul that his anointing was real and that God was truly preparing him for the enormous responsibility of leading his people. Sometime after the private anointing, Samuel called all the people of Israel to gather at Mizpah for a sacred assembly before the Lord. The people came from every tribe and clan, not knowing that they were about to witness the public selection of their first king. Samuel stood before this great crowd and reminded them of their history with God, how the Lord had brought them out of Egypt and saved them from all their enemies. But then his tone became more serious as he addressed their recent request. 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 19 records Samuel's words, "But you have today rejected your God, who himself saved you from all your adversities and your tribulations. And you have said to him, 'No, set a king over us.' Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans." Samuel wanted them to remember what they were giving up and to understand that this decision had consequences. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the selection of their king. But God did not simply point to someone in the crowd or have Samuel announce his choice. Instead, the Lord chose to use the casting of lots, a method the Israelites understood and trusted for discovering God's will. The process began with all 12 tribes, and the lot fell on the tribe of Benjamin. Then they narrowed it down to the families within Benjamin, and the lot fell on the family of Matri. Finally, they selected from the individuals in that family, and the lot fell on Saul, the son of Kish. The people looked around excitedly, wanting to see their chosen king. But there was one problem. Saul was nowhere to be found. 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 22 tells us what happened next. "Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, 'Has the man come here yet?' And the Lord answered, 'There he is, hidden among the equipment.'" In a moment that would have been almost comical if it were not so important, they found their future king hiding among the baggage and supplies. When they brought Saul out and he stood among the people, his impressive height made him tower above everyone else. Samuel presented him to the nation with these words from 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 24. "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people?" The people shouted their approval, crying out, "Long live the king!" Israel finally had the king they had demanded, chosen by God himself and confirmed before the entire nation. About a month after Saul had been publicly chosen as king at Mizpah, a crisis arose that would give him the perfect opportunity to prove himself as Israel's leader. The city of Jabesh Gilead, located east of the Jordan River, found itself under siege by a brutal enemy named Nahash the Ammonite. This was not just a military attack. Nahash had made demands that were designed to humiliate and permanently weaken the people of Jabesh Gilead. 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 2 records Nahash's cruel terms, and Nahash the Ammonite answered them, "On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel." Nahash wanted to gouge out the right eye of every man in the city, which would not only mark them as his defeated enemies, but would also make them useless as archers in any future battles. The people of Jabesh Gilead were horrified by these terms and asked for 7 days to see if anyone in Israel would come to their rescue. When messengers brought news of this threat to Gibeah, where Saul lived, he was coming in from the fields behind his oxen, still working like a farmer rather than living in a palace like other kings. But when Saul heard what Nahash was planning to do to his fellow Israelites, something powerful happened inside him. 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 6 tells us that the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news, and his anger was greatly aroused. This was not just human anger, this was righteous fury inspired by God's Spirit. Saul immediately took action that showed both his leadership ability and his understanding of how to motivate the people. He took his oxen, cut them in pieces, and sent the pieces throughout Israel with a message that anyone who did not follow Saul and Samuel to battle would have their oxen treated the same way. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 7 records that the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. Saul gathered an army of 330,000 men and led them in a surprise attack against the Ammonites at dawn. The victory was so complete that 1 Samuel chapter 11 verse 11 tells us those who survived were scattered, so that no two of them were left together. Saul had proven himself as a military leader and saved his people from a terrible fate. After Saul's stunning victory over the Ammonites, Samuel called all Israel together at Gilgal for a ceremony that would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. This was going to be Samuel's official farewell as Israel's judge, and he wanted to address the nation one final time before fully transferring authority to their new king. Standing before the massive crowd of people who had followed him for decades, Samuel began what would become one of the most important speeches in Israel's history. But instead of talking about his own accomplishments or giving advice about the future, Samuel did something unexpected. He challenged the people to examine his character and leadership. 1 Samuel chapter 12 verses 3 and 4 record his bold challenge. "Here I am. Witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I received any bribe with which to blind my eyes? I will restore it to you." Samuel was asking the entire nation to think back over all the years he had served as their judge and to publicly accuse him if he had ever been dishonest, corrupt, or unfair. The people's response was immediate and unanimous. They declared that Samuel had never taken anything from anyone, never cheated them, never oppressed them, and never accepted bribes. Samuel had them acknowledge this before the Lord as their witness, establishing his integrity for all history to remember. But Samuel was not fishing for compliments or trying to make himself look good. He was making a point about leadership and character that would be important for their future with King Saul. After establishing his own record, Samuel reminded the people of their history with God, recounting how the Lord had brought them out of Egypt, given them judges to deliver them from their enemies, and blessed them when they were faithful. Then he addressed their request for a king with words that showed both understanding and warning. In 1 Samuel chapter 12 verse 14, he told them, "If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice, and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God." Samuel was making it clear that having a king would not change their fundamental relationship with God or their need to obey his commands. 2 years into his reign, King Saul faced a military crisis that would reveal a dangerous flaw in his character and mark the beginning of his downfall. The Philistines had assembled a massive army with 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and foot soldiers as numerous as sand on the seashore. They had also established a garrison at Michmash, right in the heart of Israelite territory, which was both a military threat and a national humiliation. Saul had summoned the people to gather at Gilgal, where Samuel had told him to wait 7 days for the prophet to arrive and offer sacrifices to the Lord before going into battle. This was not just a religious formality. Seeking God's blessing before battle was essential for Israel's success, and only priests were authorized to make these sacred offerings. But as the days passed and Samuel had not yet appeared, Saul watched his army begin to fall apart. 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 8 tells us what was happening. Then he waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. The soldiers were terrified by the size of the Philistine army and were deserting in large numbers, hiding in caves, rocks, and even fleeing across the Jordan River. Saul could see his military advantage disappearing with each passing hour, and his impatience began to override his judgment. Instead of trusting God's timing and waiting for Samuel as he had been instructed, Saul made a decision that would have devastating consequences. 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 9 records his fateful choice. So Saul said, "Bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me." And he offered the burnt offering. Saul had stepped outside his authority as king and taken on the role of priest, something that God had never given him permission to do. The moment he finished offering the sacrifice, Samuel arrived and immediately understood what had happened. When Samuel asked what Saul had done, the king tried to justify his actions by explaining about his dwindling army and his fear that the Philistines would attack before they had sought God's blessing. But Samuel's response in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 13 was devastating. "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever." Saul's impatience and disobedience had cost him God's permanent blessing on his dynasty. Sometime later, Samuel came to Saul with a direct command from the Lord that would test the king's obedience in the most serious way possible. This was not advice or suggestion. This was a divine order that came with specific details and left no room for interpretation. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 3 records God's command. "Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. But kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." The Amalekites were ancient enemies of Israel who had attacked God's people when they were weak and vulnerable during their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. God had promised to deal with Amalek, and now the time had come for complete judgment. The command for total destruction was harsh by human standards, but it came from God's perfect justice and his knowledge of how evil these people had become. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites, and the military campaign was completely successful. His forces defeated the enemy army and captured their cities, achieving total victory on the battlefield. But when it came time to carry out God's specific instructions about destroying everything, Saul made decisions that directly violated what the Lord had commanded. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 9 tells us what Saul actually did. "But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless that they utterly destroyed." Saul had decided to keep King Agag alive as a trophy of war, and his soldiers had kept the best livestock for themselves, while only destroying the animals that were not worth keeping. They had turned God's command into a selective process based on their own judgment about what was valuable, rather than obeying exactly what the Lord had said. Saul probably thought he was being practical and wise, saving the good animals for sacrifices to God and keeping the enemy king as proof of their victory. But he had completely missed the point of God's command, which was about obedience and trust rather than military strategy or economic benefit. That night, the word of the Lord came to Samuel with news that broke the old prophet's heart. God told him that he regretted making Saul king because Saul had turned back from following him and had not performed his commandments. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 11 records Samuel's response. "And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night." Samuel had invested years of his life in Saul, had anointed him as king, and had watched him achieve early successes. Now he had to face the reality that the man he had chosen by God's direction had failed in his most important test. The next morning, Samuel set out to find Saul and deliver what would be one of the most difficult messages of his prophetic career. When Samuel found the king, Saul greeted him with enthusiasm and apparent confidence about his mission. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 13, Saul declared, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." But even as Saul was claiming obedience, Samuel could hear the sound of sheep bleating and cattle lowing in the background. Samuel's response cut straight through Saul's attempted deception. "What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" When confronted with this obvious evidence of his disobedience, Saul tried to shift the blame to his soldiers and justify his actions by claiming the animals were being saved for sacrifices to God. But Samuel was not interested in excuses or rationalizations. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, he delivered one of the most important principles in all of Scripture. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Samuel explained that God values obedience far more than religious rituals, and that Saul's rebellion was as serious as witchcraft and idolatry. Then came the devastating pronouncement that would haunt Saul for the rest of his life. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 26 records Samuel's words, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul grabbed his robe in desperation, and the fabric tore in his hand. Samuel immediately turned this accident into a prophetic sign, declaring that God had torn the kingdom of Israel from Saul and would give it to someone better than him. After delivering God's judgment to Saul, Samuel demanded that the Amalekite king be brought to him. King Agag had probably been enjoying his unexpected reprieve from death, thinking that his royal status had saved him from the fate of his people. When Agag was brought before Samuel, he came confidently, believing that the danger had passed. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 32 tells us that Agag came to him cautiously. And Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." Agag thought that since he had survived this long, the Israelites had decided to spare his life permanently. But Samuel had not forgotten God's command, even if Saul had chosen to ignore it. The old prophet looked at this enemy king who had caused so much suffering to God's people over the years, and his response was swift and final. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 33 records Samuel's words and actions. But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. This was not an act of personal revenge or cruelty. This was Samuel carrying out the judgment that God had commanded and that Saul had failed to execute. Samuel understood that God's commands are not suggestions to be modified based on human judgment or convenience. When the Lord gives specific instructions, they must be followed completely, regardless of how difficult or unpleasant they might seem. By executing Agag himself, Samuel demonstrated the kind of obedience that God expected from his people, and especially from their leaders. This dramatic scene also served as a powerful reminder to everyone present that God's word does not change based on human preferences or political considerations. The command to destroy the Amalekites completely had come from the Lord, and it would be fulfilled one way or another. After this confrontation, Samuel departed from Gilgal, and the text tells us that he did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Though Samuel mourned for Saul because of what might have been if the king had chosen obedience over his own judgment, while Samuel was still mourning over Saul's failure, the Lord spoke to him with a message that would begin the next chapter in Israel's royal history. God asked Samuel how long he would continue grieving for Saul when he had already rejected him as king, and then he gave the prophet a new mission that would require both courage and secrecy. 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 1 records God's instructions. "Fill your horn with oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." This was an extremely dangerous assignment because Saul was still the reigning king, and anointing someone else as his replacement could be seen as treason, punishable by death. Samuel expressed his concern to God, saying that if Saul heard about it, he would kill him. The Lord provided a cover story for Samuel's trip. He would go to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice and invite Jesse and his family to participate. When Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the city were nervous about his visit, wondering if he had come because of some sin they had committed. But Samuel assured them he had come in peace to sacrifice to the Lord. He invited Jesse and his sons to the sacrifice, And when they arrived, Samuel began looking for the man God had chosen as Israel's next king. When Samuel saw Jesse's oldest son Eliab, he was immediately impressed by the young man's appearance and height, thinking this must be God's choice. But the Lord quickly corrected Samuel's thinking. 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 7 records God's important lesson. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One by one, Jesse presented 7 of his sons to Samuel, and one by one, God indicated that none of these was his chosen king. Finally, Samuel asked Jesse if these were all his children, and Jesse mentioned that his youngest son was out watching the sheep. Samuel insisted that they send for this boy, saying they would not sit down to eat until he arrived. When young David came in from the fields, Samuel knew immediately that this was God's choice. 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 12 describes the moment. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Samuel took his horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. The final chapter of Samuel's remarkable life came to a close when the great prophet and judge died at his home in Ramah, surrounded by the people who had known and loved him throughout his long career of faithful service. Samuel had lived to see Israel transition from a loose confederation of tribes led by judges to a monarchy ruled by kings. And he had played the crucial role in making that transition possible while maintaining the nation's relationship with God. His death marked the end of an era that had begun with his miraculous birth to Hannah and had encompassed some of the most important events in Israel's history. When news of Samuel's death spread throughout the land, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 1 Samuel chapter 25 verse 1 tells us simply but powerfully, "Then Samuel died, and the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him, and buried him at his home in Ramah." This was not just a funeral for an important leader. This was a national outpouring of grief for a man who had shaped their identity as God's chosen people. People came from every tribe and every corner of the land to pay their respects to the prophet who had heard God's voice as a child and had continued to speak the Lord's words faithfully until the day he died. Samuel had judged Israel with integrity and fairness, never taking bribes or showing favoritism to the wealthy and powerful. He had confronted kings when they disobeyed God, anointed rulers according to divine direction, and consistently called the people back to covenant faithfulness. As the mourners gathered at his burial site in Ramah, they remembered not just his public accomplishments, but his personal character, his humility, his devotion to prayer, his fearless delivery of difficult messages, and his unwavering commitment to serving God above all else. Samuel had been the bridge between the age of judges and the age of kings. And now Israel would have to move forward into their future without the steady guidance of the man who had helped them navigate their most challenging transitions. His legacy would live on in the kings he had anointed, the principles he had taught, and the example he had set of what it meant to be completely faithful to the Lord. If you've been inspired by Samuel's faithfulness and want to discover more incredible Bible stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Share this story with your friends and family. Everyone needs to hear about the boy who became God's powerful prophet and the woman whose prayer changed a nation. Which part of Samuel's story touched your heart the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it blessed you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the Bible's most remarkable lives.